The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. This is Laura Battle with Pensionmark Retirement Group. I want to thank you all for joining us in part of our monthly education program via our webinar series. We're going to get started in just approximately about 1 or 2 minutes. There's a few other folks that are joining the webinar, so we're going to wait for them to log in, and then we'll go ahead and get started, and we'll go over some housekeeping items and go from there. So just sit tight for about 1 or 2 more minutes, if you would. Thank you. Okay, thank you everybody for holding. We're going to go ahead and get started. Again, this is Laura Battle with Pensionmark Retirement Group. We'd like to welcome you to our September series of part of our education webinars. This month we're excited to have with us a special guest speaker from BlackRock, and I'll go ahead and introduce him with his presentation of Navigating Tough Terrain. This is specifically designed for plan sponsors and fiduciaries of our retirement plans. And this month we have Don Allen, who is a defined contribution internal sales member in the South Central and Southwest states of BlackRock. Don focuses on providing investment solutions and resources. He's been in his current role since joining BlackRock in 2010. Prior to joining BlackRock, Mr. Allen has worked with Lincoln Financial Group and the Vanguard Group, and he has more than 5 years of industry experience. So we're excited to have him with us in the presentation of Mapping Your Course, where he's going to go through some discipline processes to help limit your fiduciary liability as plan sponsors. So I'd like to welcome Mr. Allen.
Laura, thank you very much. And before we get started, on behalf of BlackRock, I want to say thank you for everyone for taking time out of their schedules today to be on the webinar with us. And I want to thank Pensionmark for allowing BlackRock to be a resource in today's webinar. I think now more than ever, plan sponsors have a growing concern over their roles and responsibilities to their defined contribution plans and to the participants investing in those plans. And what's been interesting is recent studies have shown that there is a gap between what participants believe are important within their defined contribution plans and what plan sponsors view as their roles and responsibilities. And I think underlying all of that is ultimately what is the plan sponsor's role as a fiduciary within their defined contribution plan. So today what we'd like to do in the next 25 to 30 minutes is walk through the presentation, which essentially provides an overview of what a fiduciary is within the defined contribution plan space, some of
And
the
Don,
risks
if I
that are.
could just interrupt you, I'm so sorry.
Absolutely.
I forgot a housekeeping item. I apologize for everyone. My coffee hasn't kicked in. We have everyone on mute, and if you'd like to submit a question during Don's presentation, we will go through those at the end of the webinar. You should have a question box on your computer where you can go ahead and submit any questions that you have. So everyone, all lines are muted, and go ahead and submit any questions during the presentation that you have via your question or chat box, and we'll go ahead and address those at the end of the webinar. So again, a housekeeping item I forgot to mention. So thank you. Go ahead, Don.
Thank you, Laura. So again, our hopes today are to leave you with an understanding as to exactly what a fiduciary is, what some of the risks of being a fiduciary are, and then most importantly, I think what we hope that you walk away with is a better understanding as to how using a disciplined process within your defined contribution plans, whether it be reviewing service providers, investment menu, using a disciplined process can very much help to mitigate the risks inherent to being a fiduciary. So just looking at our first slide, for those on the call, congratulations, you are a fiduciary. And what's interesting is, there's been a misconception among plan sponsors and even among financial advisors as to exactly what a fiduciary is in the defined contribution plan space. And ultimately, a fiduciary is anyone who is exercising control over any part of that retirement plan. So essentially, talking about financial advisors who are providing investment advice to participants, they are exercising some form of control over the plan and are thus described as a fiduciary. But again, broadly speaking, anyone who's exercising control over any part of that plan, and it is critical to understand the full range and nuances of those fiduciary responsibilities. Under the Department of Labor, fiduciaries are required to follow the prudent person rule, essentially saying that prudence, care, and skill needs to be utilized when making decisions on behalf of others, namely the defined contribution plan participants. Diversification rule, the investment menu that we're providing to our participants, are we offering a broad range of investment choices that allow participants to craft a well-diversified investment menu on their own behalf? The exclusive benefit rule, which speaks to the fact that the benefits within the defined contribution plan are those of the members, their survivors, and their beneficiaries. And also, in terms of communication and disclosure to participants, very important, needing to act in accordance with plan documents and provide necessary and timely information to plan participants about their defined contribution plan. Laura, if we could just go to the next slide there. So I mentioned some of the risks of being a defined contribution plan fiduciary. What we've seen in the past decade and really in the beginning part of the decade was an increase in the number of ERISA lawsuits as a result of market downturns. Most recently, a case, LaRue versus DeWolf, really changed the landscape of the defined contribution space and the role of the fiduciary, and this is kind of what has resulted in a lot of concern among plan sponsors as to exactly what their roles and responsibilities are. But that case, basically coming out of that, allowed individual participants within their plan to sue their plan sponsor, no longer needing a class action lawsuit to bring suit among to the plan sponsor. And a simple mistake can really ultimately mean a breach of fiduciary duty. As a fiduciary, you are personally liable for the defined contribution plan changes that are made and any impending lawsuits or concerns on behalf of participants. That is really ultimately the responsibility of the fiduciaries to the plan. So again, it's very important to understand the risks in being a fiduciary, and again, how we can best effectively mitigate those risks. Laura, if we can go to the next slide, please. So ultimately, when we're talking to financial advisors and 401k plan sponsors, what we're really telling them is that it's not so much the destination or the ultimate decision that's being made as much as it is the journey and the process that was taken to get to that ultimate decision. And the 4 steps that we want to highlight today in some of the key fiduciary activities are due diligence, implementation, documentation, and ongoing review. Next slide, please, Laura. Looking at some of the key fiduciary activities, I'm sure things that look very familiar to many of the individuals on the call here. Selecting and monitoring service providers. And what's interesting is that service providers is a pretty broad term speaking to not only 401k plan record keepers, investment managers, but also to financial advisors and consultants. Selecting and monitoring the plan investments. How are we going to make sure that we are crafting the most broadly diversified and appropriate investment menu on behalf of our plan participants? And lastly, providing participant education and disclosure to the individuals investing in that 401k retirement plan. So ultimately, what we hope is that disciplined process that we have mentioned of due diligence, implementation, documentation, and ongoing review can be used in some of these key fiduciary activities. Next slide, please, Laura. So looking at one of those first fiduciary activities, selecting and monitoring service providers. Again, what's been so interesting, and one of the trends that we've seen lately with defined contribution plan sponsors is utilizing benchmarking for their 401k defined contribution plan to really evaluate the service providers that they're using. And again, service providers is a pretty broad term, so we're talking about financial advisors and consultants. We're talking about the record keepers that we're using and the custodians of those 401k plans. And ultimately, in terms of due diligence, we're evaluating plan needs and analyzing whether or not certain providers are giving us the best match for those needs inherent to the plan. Implementing those potential changes in terms of service providers, enacting service agreements with those different service providers, whether it be financial advisors or record keepers, that clearly outline each individual's responsibilities. Documentation, I think, is something that plan sponsors are realizing is the most important key. Again, what we mentioned is it's not so much that journey, but it ultimately is the destination and how you arrived at a certain decision. So documenting the methodology for provider selection and maintaining an archive of old service contracts along with the new ones certainly goes a long way in justifying decisions that were made along the road in the event at some point in the future suit is brought against a plan sponsor, or there are concerns over to how one part of the plan was managed. There is a clearly defined path that was walked along, and decisions were made to ultimately get the plan to where it was in the best interest of those plan participants. And again, ongoing review. So we want to do what's best on behalf of our plan participants, and from time to time, changes are going to be made within the 401k plan, whether or not it's moving from one record keeper to another, looking at utilizing an advisor or consultant for the plan, or perhaps making some changes to the investment menu. While those changes are important and can certainly strengthen the benefit of the overall plan, we also want to make sure that we're reviewing them on a consistent basis with those service providers to make sure that what we ultimately implemented and the changes that we made are still meeting the requirements that we kind of put forth. So holding meetings with all of our providers, with our financial advisors, doing due diligence, on the investments within the plan, regularly reviewing the appropriateness of service providers' fee structures. So not just so much understanding what the fees are within the 401k plan, but really knowing whether or not those fees are reasonable based on the service that's being provided. And lastly, ensuring that service providers are meeting their obligations, and ultimately, if we do need to do another replacement or make another change, again, we've documented the process and we've done our review, which justifies an ultimate decision. Next slide, please, Laura. Kind of elaborating more on service providers. We obviously want to make sure we're evaluating criteria of the selected providers to determine the best fit for our particular plan. So looking at service providers, is the culture, values, and the overall value proposition aligned with that of the plans? How do they handle customer service? How do they handle participant disclosure? What services are they going to provide us to help us monitor our plan's investments? These are concerns that plan sponsors have, and ultimately things that need to be evaluated when looking at different service providers, and ultimately making a decision as to whether to continue on with a particular service provider or perhaps make a change on behalf of the plan and participants. And ultimately, does the product meet your needs and constraints? Hypothetically speaking, is this record keeper able to provide our participants with a Roth account within their 401k plans? Do they allow for certain features like quarterly rebalancing and auto-escalation and auto-enrollment, things that are very important nowadays in helping participants to achieve success in retirement? Do record keepers fill those needs for us? Looking at financial advisors, are financial advisors willing to meet with us on a quarterly basis? How are they going to ultimately help us make this plan the best that it can be on behalf of those plan participants? So ultimately, really evaluating what those service providers are bringing to the table and whether or not it does mesh with what's needed on behalf of those plan participants. Next slide, please, Laura. Looking at plan investments, obviously a very big part of the defined contribution plan. And again, we look at those four, that discipline process that we had mentioned of due diligence, implementation, documentation, and ongoing review. So we had mentioned earlier the diversification rule, making sure that the investment lineup that we're putting in front of our plan participants is truly diversified and is allowing them to craft a menu that is properly diversified based on their age profile, their risk profile, where they're at, and what their objectives are. So understanding what a truly diversified menu is. And we had mentioned fees also, not so much understanding exactly what those fees are. While that's incredibly important, knowing what participants are paying, what the plan is ultimately paying for those investments, I think what we're seeing now is more importantly, are those fees reasonable? So if we have an investment within our plan that's performed incredibly well over periods of time and has been an exceptional investment on behalf of our participants, but perhaps is slightly more expensive than some other options within that same space, again, documenting the review of those investments is ultimately going to be in the best interest of fiduciaries to the plan. So we know that we have an investment that's done well on behalf of participants, even though it's maybe a little bit more expensive than what we typically see. We know that, relatively speaking, the fund has performed very well. And I say that because it was a situation that had come up recently in a meeting that we had where a plan sponsor was very concerned over their plan fees and was looking to make some changes solely based on fees. And what we really wanted to highlight was understanding the fees is absolutely important, but understanding the reasonableness of those fees is more important. So a fund that has performed very well on behalf of participants doesn't necessarily need to be considered for removal if it continues to perform up to certain requirements and the fees are within reason based on that performance. Ensuring qualified default investment alternative options meet current Department of Labor guidelines. So qualified default investment alternatives are those investments that are in place within a 401k plan for those individuals that haven't made an investment menu selection and how they're going to allocate their assets. A lot of the a lot of the qualified default investments we're seeing these days in plans are risk-based investments and target date mutual funds. Making sure that those options that are being implemented within the plan are meeting current Department of Labor guidelines. So are they well diversified? Are they appropriate in terms of a risk-reward balance for those participants that will essentially be defaulted into that investment? Implementation, again, talking about offering a broad range of investment options, the possibility of considering a self-directed option on behalf of those participants so they can look outside of the investment menu we've provided to invest their retirement plan assets. Documentation. Plan sponsors nowadays are very much so providing a written investment policy statement to the participants to let the participants know essentially what the guidelines are for the development of that investment menu, how it was crafted, and what prompts change within that investment menu. So what criteria are being evaluated, how often is that criteria being evaluated to make sure that we are offering the best options to our plan participants. And again, documentation of the reasons why we would potentially add to or remove from the investment lineup we're providing. And that's kind of rolls into ongoing review. We want to make sure that when we set in motion a certain investment lineup that we're putting out there on behalf of our plan participants, we want to make sure we're reviewing it on a consistent basis, because investments, as much as we'd like to think, do not have consistent performance over time, and the investment strategy within a particular investment can change over time as well. And it's important to know that those things can take place within a particular investment strategy, because ultimately offering participants a specific investment in their lineup and thinking that that investment meets a certain criteria for a participant to craft a well-diversified menu. What we've seen a lot in especially the recent year is certain investment managers have kind of deviated from their strategy. So an example would be an investment manager who predominantly was focused on investing in U.S. domestic large cap securities, say you. And now we see that that investment manager is deviating away from the U.S. and investing some assets internationally. Well, those individuals within that 401k plan who were under the impression that they were primarily investing in a domestic investment now are not realizing the fact that some of these assets within this investment are being invested internationally. So all of a sudden, their diversification and their asset allocation gets out of whack. Again, what's most important here is ongoing review and documentation. What has changed within these particular investments? Why has it changed? How has it affected performance? And making sure that that's being documented consistently. So even if a fund is out of favor, moving out in time, or if the strategy starts to deviate from what we originally knew that strategy to be, we're making sure that we document it, so at a point, if we need to, we have a justifiable reason as to why we're making a change for this particular investment manager within the plan. Laura, next slide, please. Thank you. Looking again at qualified default investment alternatives, this has been a very big topic of conversation recently with respect to target date funds. So target date funds, many record keepers have a proprietary target date investment strategy. And we've seen a lot of plan sponsors look at those strategies as kind of inherent to being part of that 401k plan's record-keeping platform. So, for example, looking at a company like Fidelity. So having our 401k plan on the Fidelity platform, does that necessarily mean that we need to be using Fidelity's target date mutual funds? What's been interesting is for a long time, we saw a lot of plan sponsors who said, I'm on this particular platform, I'm going to adopt this particular platform's target date strategy. What we're realizing is, we want to make sure that we weren't simply defaulted into our qualified default option. So just because we're using a particular platform, we were pigeonholed into using a particular investment strategy. And I think this really came to light in 2008 off the back of the financial crisis, when participants were invested in a particular target date strategy that hadn't performed well for whatever reason. And all of a sudden, looking at their plan sponsor and saying, well, why was this particular strategy chosen on our behalf? And ultimately, the decision was, well, we're using this particular platform, and this was the target date option that was made available to us. Again, really doing our due diligence on what we're offering to participants is very important. And ultimately, sponsors are responsible for the prudent selection and monitoring of the plan's QDIA. If it's not something that is optimal on behalf of participants, being proactive in working with your service provider, your 401k plan record keeper, to implement a solution that is optimal for your participants is the most important thing. And the last point there, not taking a course of action makes an individual just as liable as taking the wrong course of action. So perhaps we opted for a particular investment strategy, and maybe that wasn't right on behalf of our participants. Not doing anything at all is just as poor a decision as doing the wrong thing on behalf of participants. So again, we ultimately want to make sure that we're doing our due diligence. What are we ultimately offering to our participants in terms of their investment strategies? How does this fit based on our participant base? And are we documenting it going forward? Are we reviewing these investments on a consistent basis to make sure that they are truly up to par and in the best interest of our 401k plan participants? Next slide, please, Laura. So talking about ongoing review and documentation, it's very important to have a methodology in place as to how funds are going to be added to the 401k plan and how they're going to be removed. It's not just a matter of picking the fund that is the best performing fund out there, but ultimately having a justified approach and a reasonable approach to adding and deleting funds. So criteria should not be simplistic. There's a lot of factors that go into evaluating investment menu. And parameters need to be established around that criteria. So if we're looking at investment performance, are we setting a particular benchmark that we'd like that fund to hit on an annual basis or over certain time periods so that it does remain in our plan? And if for some reason that fund does not meet those requirements in terms of performance, what is our next step? Do we monitor it more closely and maybe more frequently to see how performance is rebounding? And if it doesn't come back, then what is our process to potentially remove this fund? Another thing that's very important for plan sponsors to consider, and something that we've seen being implemented a lot more recently, is a tiered investment menu. Too often we see 401k plans that have a large number of investments made available to participants, and ultimately what we see happening is choice overload on the participants' behalf. So participants are looking at 6 different options within a particular investment asset class and not knowing enough about the investments to differentiate those and find the particular one that is in their best interest. And unfortunately what we see is this directly affects participation rate in a negative way. So what we've seen a lot of plan sponsors do, and what a lot of advisors have done that we've worked with, are looking at investment menus and saying, are we offering our participants too much? Do we want to provide them a tier menu that has a few very well diversified options, like a target date fund, some investments kind of in the second tier that are going to hit certain asset classes that are most appropriate on behalf of our plan participants, and then perhaps a third tier that are more specific investment mandates, so that participants have the ability to diversify and get some exposure in certain areas that they deem necessary. But again, I think the trend we're seeing is more consolidation than addition to in terms of the 401k plan menu. I think the most important thing, again, in terms of the investments, is scheduling periodic reviews with your financial advisor to ensure that the lineup that you're providing to participants is meeting the criteria that you set out. That investment policy statement that was put in place, is that criteria still being met? Are the investments doing what they should be doing on behalf of participants? And reviewing that periodically gives you a justification as to whether they are or they are not. And then ultimately, if a decision needs to be made as to why something was removed or a particular investment was added to the plan, we have a justifiable, documented reason and kind of path that we went along as to the ultimate decision that we made. Looking at you know, a little case study on large cap funds and performance consistency, you'll see from the graph there, and Laura, I'm on slide 11 now, I apologize. But looking at that graph, we see how funds within the large cap blend space have performed over a 3- and 5-year period. And you see that there's no real great consistency. You see that only less than half of mutual funds that were screened here were in the top 25% of their peer group in the 3-year period. Only 20% of those funds were in the top 25% of their peer group over a 5-year period. So again, we see, and I spoke to the fact that we know that investment performance is not consistent, and while it's not consistent, again, the most important thing to do is to set that criteria. So if we have a fund that has performed very well, has been in the top quartile of its peer group for the past 3 years, and then perhaps moves out of favor, what is our next step? What criteria are we using to evaluate that fund going forward? And ultimately, what's going to be our decision-making process to implement a change on behalf of our participants? Next slide, Laura, please. The last key activity that we wanted to touch on was participant education and disclosure. So again, following that disciplined process, due diligence, establishing communication for plan participants. Are we going to have quarterly meetings with our participants to educate them on investing for retirement, communicating the benefits of investing for retirement? Are we going to have our financial advisor come out on a quarterly basis to talk about education and talk about investing? Implementation. So once we kind of have a course of action in place, how are we going to implement that course of action? Are we going to use a participant website? Are we going to provide mailers, payroll stuffers, things of that nature, to make sure that we're getting the appropriate information in front of our plan sponsors so that they can make decisions on their own behalf? Are we 404C compliant? Again, speaking to the diversification rule, are we providing a diverse menu on behalf of our plan participants? Documenting, again, the education and disclosure, keeping attendance lists. Who is attending the meetings that we're holding on behalf of our participants? You know, down the road, again, we're in a position now where an individual participant has the ability to sue their plan sponsor if they assume a breach of fiduciary duty took place. And again, documenting participants' participation, if you will, in meetings, in educational seminars, documenting the fact that certain materials were provided to them on their behalf for their educative purposes. Knowing that that took place certainly helps the plan sponsor protect themselves from a fiduciary standpoint. And again, ongoing review. Holding participant seminars are an incredibly effective way to see what's being done well within the plan and what can be improved upon. Next slide, please, Laura. Speaking to 404C compliance, again, it can protect you. It can provide safeguards given that plan sponsors are deemed fiduciaries on a plan. But yet we're finding that only about 60% of plan sponsors intend to comply for reasons of cost, complexity, and inconvenience. And really, ultimately, there is no great reason to avoid complying, because if you think about the cost, complexities, and the inconvenience of potentially breaching 404C compliance could far outweigh complying with that particular mandate. So certainly something that needs to be discussed with your financial advisor, and how to make sure that consistently going out in time you are compliant with respect to 404C. Next slide, please, Laura. Elaborating a little bit more on 404C, it requires more than just an investment perspective. General description of each investment, encouraging participants to review information on the investment, a description of the investment objectives, risk and return characteristics, how investments can benefit the participants in terms of diversification of their portfolio, identification of the investment managers, who are we ultimately deciding to manage these strategies on behalf of our plan participants, a description of the transaction fees and expenses against the participant's account. So again, very important to understand those, but also very, very important to understand the reasonableness of those fees that are being applied against the participant's account. And contact information for the plan fiduciary responsible for that information. It could be the plan sponsor, a benefits manager, the financial advisor, or the investment manager if participants have questions, making sure that they have access to those individuals if they do indeed have questions, so that we are acting in the best interest of those participants. Slide 15, Laura. So again, a little bit more on 404C compliance. Does the plan document state that the plan intends to comply with 404C? So bundled 401k packages provide convenience and efficiency. It is the plan sponsor's fiduciary to monitor them. Helps plan sponsors to understand what the plan offers and how it relates to 404C. Example, has your plan sponsor requested written confirmation that the plan meets all the requirements of 104B for electronic delivery methods? Again, periodic review of these different requirements is very important. So sponsors should schedule periodic reviews with their service providers and record keepers to review their responsibilities and plans for compliance. What is the role of the plan sponsor, and what is the role of the service provider and or record keeper in terms of responsibilities? And last slide, Laura. So again, kind of summing things up here, and I think we'll have some time for questions. Ultimately, as a fiduciary, individuals are personally responsible, and I think now more than ever we're seeing that plan sponsors are showing concern around what their responsibilities are and what ultimately they are responsible for. So a lot of individuals say, well, it's my responsibility to educate participants on investments. Very, very true, but how is that being done? What is the process that is being utilized to do that? And again, the journey can be more important than the destination. So ultimately, walking down a clear path, documenting reasons as to why certain changes were made within the plan is ultimately more important than the change that was made, because down the road, if it needs to be justified, there is that documented process that essentially took place leading up to that decision. And again, not taking a course of action makes you just as liable as taking the wrong course of action. Make sure that you're always acting in the best interest of your 401k plan participants, and that you are documenting the reasons as to why certain changes were made on behalf of those participants. And obviously, again, thank you to Pensionmark, who has a wealth of resources to help plan sponsors mitigate and understand their fiduciary responsibility, and has partners like BlackRock that has additional resources that can help in that capacity. So that being said, that ends the presentation. Laura, I guess if we can open it up for questions now.
Sure, definitely. We do have a few that have come through, and thanks so much, Dawn. That was really informational, and I think really important for plan sponsors to hear, so we appreciate that. First question that came in is, how important is fiduciary liability insurance, and is it necessary to have it?
You know, it's not something that we've spoken to a great deal on our end. I think having a conversation with your record keeper to see kind of what they're seeing and what the trends are in terms of fiduciary liability insurance certainly goes a long way in protecting plan sponsors with regards to their fiduciary responsibility. But I think, again, if there is a clear-cut process in place And if there is documentation and there is proper due diligence on the different changes that are being made and what's happening within the 401k plan, that plan sponsors can very, very effectively mitigate any risk from a fiduciary standpoint. That being said, fiduciary liability insurance is certainly something that should be considered, and I think a conversation with plan's financial advisor and their record keeper in terms of what that would look and feel like is certainly appropriate.
Okay, great. Second question that came in was, in regards to selecting and monitoring service providers, what would you say is the most important factor, such as fees, participant communications, record keeping / administrative services? What would be one of the most important factors in comparing providers?
In comparing providers, again, I think it's going to be ultimately what is in the best interest of your particular plan. So not all DC plans are made the same. Plan participant demographics are very different. That being said, it's important to talk with different record keepers to see what they can do in terms of plan design, what they can do in terms of investment menus. So obviously creating a well-diversified menu is very important, but does it make sense on behalf of our participants to perhaps open up a brokerage window outside of the investment menu that we create on their behalf? Do we look at target date funds versus risk-based options as our qualified default investment alternative? I think before comparing record keepers, it's ultimately an understanding as to what is in the best interest of the plan participants. Recent example is we had an advisor who was working with a plan sponsor who understood that the majority of the participants within that plan were what we considered accidental investors, so not very investment savvy, and more importantly knew well that education, while it was important, providing information to participants on the importance of investing and saving for retirement and the investments that were within their plan, ultimately realized that it wasn't the most effective way to implement or invoke change on behalf of participants, and concern grew over whether participants who were invested in the plan were really properly diversified. So looking at a record keeper who is able to conduct re-enrollment perhaps on behalf of participants to reallocate their assets into a well-diversified, say, target date or risk-based model. So, I think ultimately it's first determining what your participant base looks like and what are the needs of your participants, and then going out to the market and knowing which particular record keepers can provide those solutions that are tailored to your needs. And then I think secondly, it's understanding the reasonableness of fees. And I go back to reasonableness as opposed to just understanding fees, in that one particular service provider may be more expensive than another, but if that service provider is doing quarterly educational meetings for your participants and is affecting participation rates, that goes a long way in justifying that additional cost perhaps from the service provider. So I think my lengthy answer, and I apologize, is really first understanding what the ultimate needs of the plan participants are, and then understanding the reasonableness of the fees across different record keepers based on which solution is most appropriate for your clients.
Okay, thanks. That was really a good answer. Here's another question that's come in from one of our plan sponsors. In your experience, what are one or two of the main items or issues that audits are uncovering that fiduciaries are doing wrong or that they're doing incorrectly?
Incorrectly, I think one has been, I had mentioned the financial crisis, and coming off of 2008, we saw a lot of plan participants, and we had mentioned the one case, LaRue versus DeWolf, basically allowing individual participants to sue their plan sponsors. And we've seen a lot of issues and a lot of concern over what strategy was ultimately put in place in terms of the investment menu that was made available to participants. So I had mentioned the fact that plan sponsors understood that, a qualified default investment alternative was something that was not only appropriate but very important on behalf of a lot of their investors, because again, we know that a majority of them are accidental investors, and they ultimately need a solution that is very well diversified, that is essentially a one-stop shop for those participants, because we know that they're not going to make changes on their own behalf, and they're not going to reallocate their investment portfolios as they should, ultimately finding themselves in a position where their risk is a little out of whack with their investment objectives, and they're not aligned. What we've seen a lot lately, a lot of plan sponsors have had concern over this, is what is the appropriate qualified default investment alternative. So first, is it a target date solution? Is it a risk-based model? And secondly, which investment manager am I using for that qualified default investment? I'd mentioned that a lot of plan sponsors say, well, I'm going with X record keeper, so I'm going to use X's qualified default investment alternative because it's part of their platform. Nowadays, record keepers have a number of options that qualify as a qualified default investment alternative, so it's very, very important to understand what the differences are in those investment strategies and doing your due diligence as to what is most appropriate for the individual participants. If you know that your participant base is one that is not going to make changes on their own behalf, is never going to rebalance their portfolio, do you want to be using a risk-based investment that is going to provide good diversification, but it's not going to dial down risk for that participant as they get closer and closer to retirement? So perhaps it's using a target date fund that is both well diversified and dials down risk as that individual gets closer to retirement, because it's in their best interest and they're not going to make those changes on their own behalf. So I think that's without question one of the biggest concerns we've seen in the minds of plan sponsors I think in recent years coming off of the financial crisis. And then I think secondly, along the lines of the investments is, again, understanding the strategy. So if you're offering individual investments that participants can utilize within their plan, making sure that that investment strategy is still meeting the objectives that it put in place. So, we've seen certain investment managers who, as I'd mentioned, have kind of deviated from their initial investment strategy. Maybe not a problem for an individual investor, but within a 401k plan, a participant that is looking for exposure in a particular area to make sure that they are well diversified, if that investment strategy that's underlying has changed and now is investing in a different manner than it originally was, that's going to potentially negatively affect that individual participant. And it's the plan sponsor's role and responsibility to work with their financial advisor to understand what's taking place with the individual investment managers and the strategies they're utilizing, and making sure that if a change needs to be made, that it's being well documented as to why.
Great, and that is something that we here at Pensionmark can definitely help our plan sponsors with. So in the essence of time, I think I'll go ahead and stop the questions there just so everyone can get back to their, I'm sure, busy work day. So again, we thank everyone for attending, and Dawn, thank you again for a great and very valuable presentation. We appreciate that. And with that, I'll go ahead and end the webinar and wish everyone a great day. And thank you so much.